The scorching Arizona sun beating down on red sandstone cliffs, and in the middle of nowhere a lone cowboy hears the faintest cry, a single word that would change everything. Mama. What he found abandoned in that desert ravine wasn't what anyone expected, and what happened next became a legend that folks still talk about around campfires today. Before we dive into this incredible story, I'd love to know, what country are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you enjoy these untold stories from the Old West, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss tomorrow's video. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. The year was 1882, and the territory that would one day become Arizona was still a wild, unforgiving place where survival meant everything and mercy was often in short supply. Our story begins with a man named Samuel "Sam" Morrison, a weathered cowboy in his 30s who'd spent the better part of his adult life driving cattle across the endless stretches of desert and scrubland that stretched between settlements. Sam wasn't your typical drifter. He'd grown up on a small ranch in Texas, learned to ride before he could properly walk, and had a reputation for being as reliable as the sunrise. His sun-weathered face told stories of countless days under the brutal desert sun, and his calloused hands spoke of a lifetime spent working with rope, leather, and stubborn cattle. What set Sam apart from other cowboys wasn't just his skill with horses or his steady aim with a rifle. It was his keen hearing, sharpened by years of listening for the distant lowing of lost cattle or the subtle sounds that meant trouble was brewing on the horizon. On this particular morning in late September, Sam was riding alone through a stretch of high desert country, guiding a small herd of 20 head toward the trading post at Willow Creek. The landscape around him was harsh but beautiful in its own way. Towering saguaro cacti stood like silent sentinels against the pale blue sky, their arms raised in eternal supplication to the heavens. Patches of prickly pear and barrel cactus dotted the sandy ground between clusters of creosote bush and brittle bush, their yellow flowers adding splashes of color to the otherwise muted palette of the desert. The cattle were moving well that morning, content to follow the ancient game trail that wound between the rocky outcroppings and dry washes that crisscrossed this part of the territory. Sam rode easy in his saddle, his horse picking its way carefully around the scattered stones and occasional patch of cholla cactus that could lame an unwary animal in seconds. It was just past midday when Sam heard it, a sound so faint and unexpected that at first he thought it might have been the wind whistling through the rocks, or perhaps the cry of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. But something about it made him rein in his horse and listen more carefully. The cattle continued their slow progress, but Sam stayed perfectly still, straining his ears against the whisper of wind through the desert plants. There it was again, weak, barely audible, but unmistakably human. A voice calling out a single word, "Mama." Sam's blood ran cold. Out here, miles from the nearest settlement, the sound of a human voice usually meant one of two things. Either someone was in serious trouble, or someone was trying to lure him into an ambush. He'd heard plenty of stories about outlaws and hostile war parties using such tactics to draw unsuspecting travelers into traps. But this voice was different. It was high-pitched, desperate, and carried a quality that made Sam think of someone very young and very scared. Against his better judgment, and despite every survival instinct telling him to keep moving, Sam made a decision that would haunt and inspire him for the rest of his days. He left his cattle to graze in a small meadow where the grass grew thick around a seasonal spring, knowing they'd stay put as long as the water and forage lasted. Then he began following the sound, which seemed to be coming from somewhere in the maze of rocky arroyos and dry creek beds that cut through the desert floor like the lines on an old man's face. The voice came again, weaker this time, and Sam realized it was coming from below him. He was standing on the rim of a deep wash, maybe 15 feet down to the sandy bottom, with steep sides carved out by decades of flash floods during the summer monsoons. Ocotillo plants clung to the rocky walls, their long, thorny stems reaching toward the light like desperate fingers. Sam peered over the edge and felt his heart nearly stop. There, lying in a patch of shade cast by an overhanging ledge, was a small bundle wrapped in what looked like a torn piece of cloth. At first glance, it could have been anything. Discarded supplies, maybe, or the remains of someone's pack that had been lost in a flood. But as Sam's eyes adjusted to the shadowy depths of the wash, he saw movement. The bundle was moving, and from it came that same weak voice. "Mama, Mama." Without hesitation, Sam began picking his way down the steep sides of the arroyo, using roots and rock outcroppings as handholds. The descent was treacherous, and more than once loose stones gave way under his boots, sending small avalanches cascading down to the bottom. But he pressed on, driven by something he couldn't quite name, a compulsion that went deeper than simple curiosity or even basic human decency. When he finally reached the bottom of the wash, Sam approached the bundle carefully. What he found there defied every expectation and challenged everything he thought he knew about human nature. It was a child, a little girl who couldn't have been more than 3 years old, though malnutrition had left her small for her age. She was wrapped in a piece of what had once been a woman's dress, now torn and filthy from exposure to the elements. Her dark hair was matted with dust and debris, and her large brown eyes stared up at Sam with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. But what struck Sam most was not just the child's condition, though she was clearly dehydrated and weak from hunger, but the circumstances of how she'd ended up in this God-forsaken place. The wash showed clear signs of recent use as a campsite. There were the cold ashes of a fire, scattered tin cans, and other debris that suggested people had been living here temporarily. More disturbing were the obvious signs that the child had been deliberately abandoned. Her makeshift clothing suggested someone had at least made minimal effort to keep her covered, but there was no water, no food, and no shelter from the desert sun. She'd been left to die, plain and simple. As Sam knelt beside the little girl, she looked up at him and spoke that single word again, "Mama." But this time, Sam realized she wasn't calling for her mother when she was looking directly at him, and something in her eyes suggested she was trying to communicate something important. Sam had no experience caring for children, but his instincts told him the girl needed water immediately. He had a canteen on his saddle, but first he needed to get her out of this death trap. The walls of the wash would turn it into an oven as the day progressed, and if flash floods came through during the afternoon thunderstorm season, anything caught in the bottom would be swept away. Carefully, gently, Sam gathered the child in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, couldn't have been more than 25 pounds, and felt fragile as a bird. But she was alive, and when he lifted her, she didn't cry out in pain, which suggested no broken bones. The climb back up the side of the arroyo was infinitely more difficult with the child in his arms, but Sam managed it through sheer determination and no small amount of luck. When he finally reached the top, both he and the girl were breathing hard, but they were safe. Sam's horse, a steady old gelding named Charlie, showed no alarm at the sight of the child. In fact, the animal seemed to sense the gravity of the situation and stood perfectly still while Sam fetched his canteen and a piece of jerky from his saddlebags. The little girl drank water eagerly but carefully, as if some instinct told her not to gulp it down too quickly. Sam softened pieces of jerky in water and fed them to her bit by bit, watching as color slowly returned to her pale cheeks. As the afternoon wore on, Sam found himself in a dilemma he'd never imagined facing. He had cattle to deliver, contracts to fulfill, and a reputation to maintain. But he also had a child who would die if he simply left her at the nearest settlement. Most frontier towns had no facilities for caring for orphans, and the few that did were often little better than the circumstances he'd just rescued her from. It was while he was pondering this problem that the little girl spoke again, this time more clearly. "Mama," she said, pointing not toward some distant horizon as Sam had expected, but directly at him. And then it hit him. She wasn't calling for her mother. She was calling him Mama. In her young mind, this stranger who had appeared from nowhere, who had given her water and food and gentle treatment, had become the maternal figure she desperately needed. The realization struck Sam like a physical blow. This child had been so starved for basic human care and affection that she was ready to attach herself to anyone who showed her kindness. The people who had abandoned her, and Sam had no doubt now that she'd been deliberately left to die, had robbed her not just of her life, but of her ability to trust in the basic goodness of humanity. But they hadn't succeeded completely. The fact that she was willing to trust him, to call him by the most sacred word in her limited vocabulary, suggested a resilience that Sam found both heartbreaking and inspiring. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Sam made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He wouldn't abandon this child as others had done, but he also couldn't simply drop her off at the nearest town and hope for the best. The little girl had fallen asleep in his arms, exhausted by her ordeal, but seemingly peaceful for the first time in who knows how long. As Sam held her, feeling her steady breathing against his chest, he found himself making promises he'd never expected to make. He would find her a proper home, not just any home, but one where she would be loved and cared for as every child deserved. He would use his savings, call in favors, and do whatever it took to ensure she had a chance at the kind of life that had been stolen from her by whoever had thrown her away like unwanted trash. But more than that, Sam realized he was making a promise to himself. He would never again be able to simply ride past human suffering without stopping to help. This little girl, who had looked up at him from the depths of that wash and called him Mama, had changed something fundamental in his understanding of what it meant to be human. The next morning, Sam made the difficult decision to abandon his cattle drive. He knew it would cost him his contract and probably his reputation with the local cattle buyers, but some things were more important than money or professional standing. Instead of continuing toward Willow Creek, he turned toward the territorial capital, where he knew there was a mission run by a group of sisters who had a reputation for taking in children regardless of their background or circumstances. It would be a hard 3-day ride, but the little girl who had taken to calling him Mama Sam seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. During those 3 days on the trail, Sam learned things about patience and gentleness that years of working with horses and cattle had never taught him. He learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when the child needed water, when she was tired, when she was scared by unfamiliar sounds or sights. He learned to sing the simple songs his own mother had sung to him decades earlier, and discovered that his rough, work-hardened voice could be soothing when softened by genuine care. Most importantly, he learned that heroism wasn't always about facing down armed outlaws or surviving dangerous stampedes. Sometimes it was as simple as stopping to listen when someone, even someone very small and seemingly powerless, called out for help. When they finally reached the mission, the Mother Superior, a woman named Sister Catherine, who had spent 30 years caring for abandoned and orphaned children, took one look at Sam and the little girl and immediately understood the situation. "She's been through something terrible," Sister Catherine said as she examined the child, who clung to Sam's hand and continued calling him Mama Sam. "But she's going to be all right. You saved her life." Sam felt a tightness in his chest that he couldn't quite name. "She saved mine too," he said quietly. "I just didn't know it needed saving." The arrangements were made quickly. The sisters would care for the girl, educate her, and help her find a permanent family when she was ready. Sam promised to send money regularly and to visit whenever his work brought him through the territorial capital. But as he prepared to leave, the little girl, who the sisters had named Maria, though she would always be Mama Sam's girl in his heart, ran to him and wrapped her small arms around his legs. "Mama Sam come back?" she asked, looking up at him with those same large brown eyes that had first captured his attention in the bottom of that desert wash. "I'll come back," Sam promised, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. True to his word, Sam returned to visit Maria every few months for the next several years. He watched her grow from a traumatized, malnourished child into a bright, curious young girl who excelled in her studies and showed a particular talent for music. The sisters told him that she often spoke of her Mama Sam and the day he had rescued her from the desert. But perhaps more importantly, Sam's encounter with Maria had changed him in ways that rippled out far beyond their personal relationship. Word of his actions spread throughout the territory, and soon other cowboys and travelers began bringing abandoned or orphaned children to the mission. Sam's example had shown them that real strength lay not in looking the other way when confronted with suffering, but in having the courage to stop and help. The story became legend, told around campfires and in saloons from Texas to California. They called him Mama Sam, and far from being embarrassed by the nickname, Sam wore it as a badge of honor. He had learned that being called Mama by someone who needed care wasn't a sign of weakness, it was the highest compliment a person could receive. Years later, when Maria had grown into an accomplished young woman and had married a kind man who treated her with the respect and love she deserved, she returned to that same stretch of desert with Sam. They stood on the rim of the arroyo where he had first found her, now a successful rancher and she a teacher with children of her own. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that day?" Maria asked. Sam considered the question for a long moment, looking out over the landscape that seemed unchanged, despite all the years that had passed. The saguaro cacti still stood like sentinels, and the desert still held both beauty and danger in equal measure. "I try not to think about it," he said finally, "because then I'd have to think about all the other times I might have ridden past someone who needed help. All I know is that hearing you call out that day taught me the most important lesson of my life, which was that we're all responsible for each other, every single one of us, and that sometimes the smallest voice calling out in the wilderness is the one that can save us all." As they stood there together, Maria placed her hand on Sam's shoulder, the same shoulder where she had once rested her small head during that long ride to safety decades earlier. "Thank you, Mama Sam," she said softly, "for stopping to listen." And in that moment, Sam knew that every choice he'd made since that day in the desert had been worth it. A single word, "Mama," spoken by a discarded child, had transformed not just two lives, but had created ripples of kindness that would continue spreading long after both of them were gone. The desert stretched endlessly around them, harsh and unforgiving as ever, but Sam no longer saw it as empty or hostile. He saw it as a place where miracles could happen, where the most unlikely people could become family, and where a simple act of human decency could echo through generations. Sometimes, Sam reflected, the most important journeys weren't the ones that took you to new places. They were the ones that taught you to see the place where you already were with new eyes, and to hear the voices calling out for help that you might have missed before. If you enjoyed this incredible story of compassion and courage from the Old West, make sure to subscribe to our channel. These tales of human kindness in the harshest circumstances remind us that heroism comes in many forms, and sometimes the greatest heroes are those who simply choose to stop and listen when someone calls out for help.